Okay, let's get started. We know that you're busy, so we do want to start on time. So first, I just want to welcome everybody to another edition of Webinars for Busy Lawyers. We're happy that you took time out of your busy schedule to join us, and I'll first introduce myself. My name is Amy Levine. I'm the Director of Programs and Volunteers here at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. And for those of you who may not be aware of everything LCL does, we provide free and confidential mental health resources, addiction recovery support, and practice management services to lawyers, law school students, judges, and their family members, as well as legal business professionals. We do the Webinars for Busy Lawyers series on a monthly basis, other webinars and panel discussions throughout the year, as well as customized presentations for legal organizations. And today we're going to be talking about how legal professionals can maintain a positive mood and energy through the dark, cold winter. And this is presented by our very own Dr. Shawn Healy, and I'm very lucky to work with him. I want to mention one small housekeeping tip regarding questions. Please put those in the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Shawn Healy, who has been with LCL fast approaching 10 years. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, John. Prior to joining us, he had his own private practice and was the Director of Clinical Services and Operations for the Behavioral Health Division of the May Institute. Shawn graduated from Suffolk University with his doctorate in clinical psychology. He also co-authored the book, The Full Weight of the Law, How Legal Professionals Can Recognize and Rebound from Depression. He co-authored that book with Dr. Jeff Fortgang, another terrific clinician. Shawn serves on the Massachusetts SJC Standing Advisory Committee on Professionalism and the Massachusetts Bar Association Lawyer Wellbeing Committee. He also runs the LCL ADHD support group. And without further ado, here is Dr. Healy.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to share my screen so you can see some other visuals instead of just my face. So as Amy mentioned, and as the title of this presentation suggests, the topic today is thinking about and talking about what is helpful in sort of addressing how our mood and energy changes during the cold, dark winter months. So typically when people have, if you've heard of, changes that occur to your mood and energy in the wintertime, you probably have been introduced to the idea of seasonal affective disorder, or SAD for short. And so I want to talk about that, but I'm also going to talk about other things that are helpful just in terms of, how the seasons impact our mood and what we can do about that. So first and foremost, if I can advance the slide, let's see if this works. There we go. All right. So just a bit of trivia to impress your friends. It is a misunderstanding when people say that daylight hours decrease in the wintertime, as well as a misunderstanding that daylight hours increase in the summer. So I've grew up with this sort of misunderstanding, like, oh yeah, days get longer in the summer. That's why, we have more daylight. It's actually the opposite. So I know it's not that important, but whenever I have a tidbit of information that I find interesting, I'm like, oh, I didn't know that before. Kind of like it sticks in my brain, and then I want to use it in the future to impress people. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, my personal friend, close personal friend, told me this a while back. So just in case it's helpful to have a visual, when we think about the seasons changing, the least amount of daylight that we get is during the winter solstice, which is the first day of winter. After that, daylight starts to increase all the way up to the summer solstice, which is the first day of summer. Then it starts to repeat and go back down again. So during the winter months, even though we're getting less daylight as compared to the summer, It's actually increasing throughout the winter, and then it's decreasing throughout the summer. So why do I tell you that? One, because it's trivia, but also to think about not necessarily the amount of daylight that you're getting, but to think about how we think about the winter months, right? So what are our expectations, right? If we have it in our minds that, oh, the winter is going to be dark and gloomy, then sometimes that expectation will impact our mood, right? So just starting with some data, we know what to expect, right? Also, temperature affects our mood and our activity in different ways, which I'll get into. But just to, again, little trivia, impress your friends. Okay, so seasonal affective disorder is the experience of a significant change in your mood and behavior based on the changing of the seasons. Typically, when we talk about seasonal affective disorder, we're referring to the changes that occur in the winter months, right? Because that's the most common type of SAD. So that's called winter pattern SAD. Sometimes we call them the winter blues. The opposite, or the summer pattern SAD, is also possible, where people feel more symptoms of depression and low energy, low mood in the summertime. It's just not as common. So if you've experienced that before, just know that that is a thing that people experience. In the Northern Hemisphere, where we are now, the seasons are going to be overlapped with certain calendar events. So I'm going to sort of try to break that down as well. It's important to recognize that oftentimes it's not just one factor that's going to be affecting how we feel, how we think, and our activities, but it's a confluence of factors. So in terms of noticing changes to our mood and energy, it's helpful to start with some basic understanding that it's normal, right? We go through changes in our mood, right? We're not just a flat emotional robot, right? We have fluctuations in our mood. This is typically tied to our thoughts, the events around us, how we respond to situations. There's lots of things that impact our mood. So you should expect changes in your mood, right? The problematic experiences is when those changes are more extreme, when they last longer than expected, when they have consequences, not just feeling a certain way, but when it impacts other areas of our lives, like our relationships, our work, our activities, and also when we feel like we don't have control, right? So if your mood changes in response to something, like, oh, I got bad news, right? Suddenly I'm not optimistic. If we think that, oh, there's something I can do about that situation, then sometimes we feel like I have some control over my mood. Or if we feel like, my awareness of my mood, my emotional intelligence is high, right? I'm aware of how I'm feeling and what is impacting my emotions moment to moment. When we have that awareness, oftentimes we feel like we have some more control in the situation, because we can identify what is impacting our mood and what we can do about that. So what options we have. So getting back to this slide, changes are normal. They're to be expected. Sometimes they're predictable, right? So when we're talking about seasonal changes or seasonal influences on our mood, that's predictable. Theoretically, the seasons change in a predictable way. And therefore, we can plan for something that's predictable. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, it's a confluence of factors. It's not just one thing. Sometimes we talk about it in a simplistic way, or we think about it in a simplistic way in terms of like, oh, it's dark earlier, and because it's dark earlier, I feel less energy, or I feel less optimistic. But oftentimes that is one factor, or can be one factor in a list of factors So the more aware we are of what those factors are and what we can do in response to those factors, the better our experience is going to be. We're going to feel like we have a little more control, which is always a good thing. All right, so I mentioned it being darker earlier. So thanks to daylight savings, which I'm going to try not to get on a rant about daylight savings and how it doesn't make sense to keep going with daylight savings. But anyway, that sudden shift, right, in daylight, that messes with us. Even though we know it's coming, we might even value that extra hour of sleep, right? When we suddenly change clocks, like we have this jolt in our environment where all of a sudden it seems like we've lost a lot of daylight because our schedules have suddenly shifted later in the sort of sun cycle. And so when we think about how our bodies respond to our environment, particularly in terms of, our ability to sleep well, right? Our brain's ability to create melatonin, which is often referred to as the hormone of darkness. Like our brains interpret darkness as like, oh, it's time to get ready to sleep, right? And that cycle of light and darkness helps our brains prepare for that sleep and wake cycle. So the production of melatonin in our pineal gland can get disrupted when all of a sudden it feels like, this jolt of darkness when our clocks change. And so it's not even though we can quickly change our clocks, we can't quickly change our brains to adjust to that sudden shift. So again, I'm not going to go on a rant about how daylight savings needs to end for children's sake, for parents' sake, for everyone's sake. But anyway, it's helpful to know that when that occurs, it is a jolt to our system, and it's helpful to prepare for it. If you're like me, I don't remember that it's coming until someone reminds me like a day before, like, oh, don't forget to set your clocks back, right? So I don't prepare for it very well. But if you know it's coming and you can remind yourself, it's helpful to prepare so it doesn't feel as much of a surprise to your system. All right. One of the things that I want to get into is thinking about what the changes of the season mean to you. All right. So colder weather, again, we're talking Northern Hemisphere here. So for this season, both in fall and winter, but also, November, the holiday season into the new year, we have colder weather, particularly in New England. So what does it mean to you, right? Does that mean you spend more time inside? Does it mean you spend more time outside? For some people, winter months mean, opportunity to spend time in the mountains, skiing, like winter hobbies. So they look forward to that change, right? For others, if their preferred activities, outdoor activities require warm weather, then cold weather might mean something very different to them than it would mean to someone who is an avid skier. So just spend a little bit of time thinking about what does cold weather mean to you? Okay. How does that impact your social interactions? All right. So we're talking about your activities, right? How does that impact your activities inside versus outside? Your social connections. If you're seeing people on a regular basis outside, like for example, in a previous neighborhood where we lived, we spent a lot of time with neighbors and the kids in our neighborhood with our kids in the summer months because they'd play together. And then almost like clockwork, once the cold weather set in, like our kids were more inside activity oriented. And it felt like we wouldn't see our neighbors for months. And then suddenly, not suddenly, but months later, like, hey, you still live here. It's great to see you again. So when that is a predictable pattern, right, if that's true for you, where you're seeing fewer people in your neighborhood, around in your social circles, that's something to be aware of and plan for. Also, like, how do you respond just to the feeling of cold weather? right? Are you someone who gets cold quickly or easily? Is it uncomfortable to feel cold, right? Or do you like feeling cold, right? Or experiencing that? I mentioned hobbies already. Like, what sort of activities of interest do you have, and are they dependent on a season, right? And if they are dependent on a warmer season, and it feels like I have nothing to do in the winter season that is enjoyable, then it might make sense to think about some hobbies that you can do in the wintertime. Also, like, are there things that you're looking forward to? I put in autumn flavors there just because me, like many other people, enjoy pumpkin, right? Pumpkin muffins, pumpkin donuts, pumpkin coffee. But for whatever reason, I know why, but only enjoy it really during this season, right? It's tied to the holidays, it's tied to the season, right? The colder months. If you offer me pumpkin coffee in July, I'm going to look at you sideways and just walk away, because I'm just going to think that that's totally inappropriate to do. It makes no sense logically, but sometimes there are things that we reserve for a season that we look forward to. So all to say, like, colder weather in the darker months, it's often a mixed bag. There are some things that we're potentially looking forward to. There are some things that we're not looking forward to. And the more that you're able to identify things in both categories, you're going to feel like you're more prepared to deal with the seasonal changes and how they impact you. Another thing to consider is how your calendar affects you. And again, in the Northern Hemisphere, fall and winter, they overlap on the major holiday seasons, right? So how does that impact you? For many of us as adults, if we've had positive holiday experiences growing up, sometimes as adults, we can have the opposite experience, because we might remember what a holiday was like, and then the reality of it now doesn't match up. It doesn't measure up to my memory. So then I have this layer of disappointment. Or maybe holidays were never an enjoyable time. Maybe they're always a stressful time. That was a time of family strife. Or maybe that was a time where I saw other people enjoying the holidays, but I didn't. All right. So whatever your history with holidays are, it's important to know what that history is, how that impacts your expectations of the holidays, right? And how that's going to affect you. Oftentimes anniversaries are important to be aware of. These anniversaries can be, a whole host of things. One of the things that comes up a lot is anniversaries of loss, right? So when someone has lost a loved one, and they might have had, positive experiences around this time of year with that person, suddenly an anniversary of their death is more salient, right? So that could impact how this time of year in your calendar is impacting you. Other things like the busy season, right? Speaking personally, I know that this time of year is a time when it feels like every week, every weekend, things are going on. There's events, there's gatherings, there's obligations, right? There's things that fill up my calendar. And it feels like, even if they're good things, even if they're things that I would prefer to do, the amount of them can feel overwhelming. It can feel like I don't have room to breathe or to sleep in or to catch my breath. So being aware of how my calendar impacts me during this time is important. And then having some boundaries around that is also important, right? Saying no to things when it feels like it's too much, even if it feels like it's a good thing, still saying no to it. Seeing more people, and then suddenly seeing fewer people is another thing that comes up a lot. So let's say the holiday season is an enjoyable time for you, then suddenly the holiday season, just like the shift in daylight savings, it all of a sudden just ends, or it can feel like it just ends, right? So after the new year, boom, no more holidays for a while, or at least that's how it feels. So it can feel like a really busy season with lots of interaction to suddenly not a busy season in terms of social events and not a lot of people. So preparing for that, recognizing, is that a welcome relief to have a break from it? Or does that feel isolating? Does that feel lonely to you to suddenly not have those social opportunities? So again, just being aware of that, understanding how that can impact your mood, how that can impact your outlook and your behavior. And then I mentioned sort of like the added activities that can just be stressful. Again, even if it's something good. So for myself, like this time of year with holidays, family birthdays, New Year's, all these things can often bring with it obligations to either attend events or to, be gift buying, gift giving. And so if that is something that is comfortable for you, if that's your love language, then it might feel very, very enriching. If that's not your love language, if that's not enriching to you, that can feel very draining. So being aware of what's going to feel like it's building you up this time of year versus what's going to drain you can be very helpful information. I mentioned the effect of cold weather on your social connections. So it's helpful to ask, where are your opportunities right now during this time to connect with others? Do your social connections change based on the season changing or the calendar? Right? Again, whether that's increasing or decreasing. One of the things to pay attention to is, even if you're physically around more people, let's say at events, work events, family events, right? There are more things happening. Even if you're physically around more people, it can often feel like you can often feel isolated in a crowd. Okay, and part of that is knowing what the best social connection frequency is for you. So like attending too many things can feel exhausting. And when we're exhausted, when we feel like I don't have enough energy to really engage with people, it can feel like I'm in a crowd but feel all alone. I just don't have the energy to sort of connect. So it's helpful to think about, what is my ideal, if you could have an ideal, what's my ideal level of social interaction for me during this time? And that can change. It can change year to year. It can change month to month. It can change based on whether you're getting good sleep or not. But just to be aware, like, this is what's preferred or ideal. And then again, making decisions based on that. So whether that is, seeking out more social connection because those opportunities aren't readily available, or making boundaries to limit them if it feels like it's too much. All right, and then also, what about your physical movement? Right? How does the colder, darker months affect your physical movement? If you're one that, again, prefers warmer weather and more sunshine, then it's common to spend more time inside in sedentary activities. Right? So I can't go to the beach, I can't go ride my bike, so I'm going to stay inside. Maybe I'm going to watch more TV, maybe I'm going to read more. But being aware of how that change in your movement and physical activity affects you is really important, because when we're physically active, that impacts our mood in a positive way. So if we have more activity during the year and then suddenly there's a steep drop off in our physical activity based or in reaction to the cold temperatures, the darkness, so forth and so on, then you've got two factors helping sort of decrease your mood, right? Less activity and less light. So be mindful of, like, what is my preferred level of activity? When I'm feeling more positive, like, what does my activity look like? And sometimes we can do this, you can have the chicken and egg debate versus, like, is my level of activity impacting my mood, or is my mood impacting how physically active I am? The easy answer is it's both, right? So the more physically active I am, the better I feel emotionally and physically. Also, the more optimistic I feel, the more likely I am to want to do something physically active. So you've probably heard the expression, fake it till you make it. This is an expression that is overused and often misunderstood. In my view, the helpful version of fake it till you make it is all about helping you do something before you feel like you're ready to do it or you're prepared to do it, right? It's not to fool somebody else. So for example, if I know I feel better after I've exercised, right? Then I might decide to fake it until I make it. I might decide to do some physical activity, even though I'm not feeling like I have all the energy I want, or I might not feel excited about it yet, right? But I'm going to do it anyway and see if my emotions or my feelings catch up to my activity. Okay. So again, you need to start with that awareness of what is helpful for your mood in terms of your activity, and then sort of pairing that with a plan to mimic that level of activity across seasons and figure out creative ways to get around barriers, right? So if you're a long distance ocean swimmer and you do that only in the summertime, you might not want to do that in the winter. Maybe you do, but God bless you. But coming up with something else that can mimic that same level of activity, but account for the barriers of the cold season. All right, so I've sort of been sprinkling in ideas here about what helps, but first and foremost, I would start with just your awareness, right? Increasing your awareness as opposed to just going with a simple idea of my mood is lower when there's less light, right? Or the seasonal changes impact me in a negative way. So just increase that awareness. Like, how does it impact you, right? What helps? Are there particular external cues that you're more sensitive to? So there's light, there's temperature. Sometimes there's, so I should say light in terms of like the amount of daylight that is in the sky. But there's also light in terms of like, if it's a sunny day and I can see a blue sky versus the sun's out, but it's, overcast. Technically, I'm still getting ultraviolet rays from the sun when it's overcast, but I don't feel as optimistic on an overcast day as when it's sunny out and I can see a blue sky. Right? So just, again, increasing that awareness of how you're impacted by those environmental cues and also what helps. Mindfulness is connected to this. So taking a moment to check in with yourself about like, how am I feeling? Like, what is helpful? What are my options? Having a plan for the barriers of the season, right? Instead of saying, I'm a swimmer in the summertime and I hate everything about the winter activities, you're going to eliminate options for yourself. So have a plan for those barriers. Can I swim inside somewhere, right? Can I get that activity, or can I have those connections that are helpful to me despite these barriers that I've identified? Whenever you can, increase your exercise, right? If you know that you're typically less physically active when it's cold out, like many of us are, trying to have a specific plan to increase that activity and exercise. And same with social supports. If you know that a pattern exists where your social supports are going to be fewer in the wintertime, make a plan for how to inject more of that social contact. And also plan enjoyable activities. Right? So engaging in enjoyable activities can be super helpful for our minds, our moods, and our bodies. Other things that help, so like the traditional treatments for seasonal affective disorder, one is light therapy. So having an ultraviolet light, just giving you more synthetic sunlight, basically. Right? Also vitamin D. We get vitamin D from sunlight. So having an increase in your vitamin regimen in the wintertime can be helpful. Sometimes when the effects of the seasonal changes are significant, then antidepressant medications can be helpful for a limited time, or talk therapy as well, right? So sometimes some people ask, like, at what point should I pursue more So like the medical model, like the more significant treatments as opposed to the things I could do on my own. And my response is usually like, well, it depends on how significant those changes are to your mood and activity and your thoughts, right? And also, if you can predict that it's going to get more significant, those changes, being more proactive, right? Starting those conversations sooner with your medical providers is helpful. And above all else, don't go it alone. So at any point in the process of these seasonal changes, if you start to feel like you're dealing with it all by yourself, that is a warning sign that you should get connected to somebody else, right? Because whenever we feel like whatever we're going through, whatever I'm dealing with, if I suddenly feel like I'm dealing with it all by myself, the weight of that thing increases, right? And the opposite happens when I feel like I'm not alone. When I'm talking to somebody else, sharing my experiences, and I can hear that someone hears what I'm saying and can validate what I'm talking about and validate my experience. Suddenly, even if the problem doesn't change at all, it feels lighter because now I'm not carrying it all by myself. So I will stop it there. There's much more to say, but I will hold up there and we can transition to any questions or comments. Feel free. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see chat better.
So I just wanted to comment earlier. Somebody really appreciated your comment on deGrasse.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's my friend.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you.
yes.
Yes, good friend. So if anybody does have any comments or questions, this is a good time. I was wondering, I know you mentioned the antidepressants. Do people typically plan for those that know that they're affected during that time of year? Are people planning, oh, I know every September I should start my antidepressants? Do people, you think, do that, or do they tend to wait and see how each season?
Everybody's different. I think typically what happens is people have conversations with their providers around, this time of year is sort of harder for me. Again, and that could be any time of year, but when there's anniversaries of loss, when there's difficult times, when there's less sunlight, and having those conversations about like what might be helpful options during this time. Sometimes it might be an increase in medication if they're already on a medication. Sometimes it's starting a medication to see if that is helpful during that period of time. And oftentimes, at least it should also involve other activities that could be helpful as well that might not have side effects like some medications do. Medications in general have.
Yeah. Excellent. And I just want to, again, go back to a comment. Increased germs and illnesses create a lot of apprehension and anxiety for the colder months, especially with a little one.
Yeah.
Any comments on that?
Absolutely. So yeah, particularly since, the start of COVID, like this has been, I know for myself as a parent, like it's always on our minds. Like whenever you have more people inside in like non-ventilated areas where you want to keep heat in and not freeze, that increases the spread of germs. So that's always a concern. I think it's, I have been encouraged to hear people's creative solutions to things like this that probably didn't exist for at least for these people prior to the pandemic. But I have been to many outdoor parties where people have like those, heat, I don't know, lamps or whatever outside. So all to say, like, it's helpful to be creative, right? So like the way that I used to do winter gatherings changed when the pandemic hit. That limited some were on Zoom, which felt strange at times. And then others were just outdoor. Like let's, instead of having it indoor, let's have it outdoor, maybe at some either open air venue or someone's backyard or some place that had more ventilation. being creative with like having a gathering inside with like your windows open and like the heat blasting for a period of time. There's costs to these things, obviously. But I think it's helpful to recognize those concerns, like to take them seriously, not to just, push them away and be like, well, I'll check out for a few months, and then when my concerns decrease, I'll come back into those gatherings. But just to be creative about like what would make it better, even if it's temporary. And again, sometimes that's waiting or making sure that the event sort of has what you need to both enjoy it and feel safe. And at times I've had conversations in the past during the pandemic when I'm like, oh, is this party indoor or outdoor? And the hosts are like, oh, does that impact your attendance? I'm like, yes, it impacts my attendance with my family. And so there are times when people move events outdoors, like to accommodate guests. So I would say, at the very least, it doesn't hurt to ask, to let people know what your comfort level is, and to see what options are available.
Excellent. Somebody says, great presentation. And she also shared a link, staying active both outdoors and indoors. So these are some suggestions. Her personal favorite indoor activity in the winter is impromptu dance parties to music. I love that.
That's good. You've got movement, you've got music, particularly if it's music that you like. I don't recommend listening to music that you don't like. But yeah, anything that's going to get your body moving and sort of like raise your endorphins there is good.
Another comment, this is when you were talking about being outside, patio heaters, of course. And in a suggestion for those burnt out by gift giving or financially stretched by it, here are some ideas. Family gifts versus each individual. Example, maybe a round robin of giving, not giving monetary gifts to adults, but rather putting the time and money into maybe a dinner out together. So that's a great
suggestions.
I did want to comment what was I found so interesting about the social interaction. And I think that some people might think, oh, I need to socialize, and that's what's going to really benefit me is more and more social interaction. However, it's really thinking about yourself and how you recharge. And sometimes that might not always be the best thing to do for yourself, and learning how to balance it. So that was an interesting point.
Yeah, I do think it's about a good balance, because there are times when people feel like, oh, I'm feeling just like low energy, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling like ugh during this time, and therefore it feels like it's going to be a slog to see other people, right? So at that point, I think what's important is to think about both options, right? Engaging in the social activity versus doing something more solitary to recharge. And like, what is the outcome of those, the likely outcome? And also look at a pattern, because sometimes we can get into a pattern of just avoiding social interactions because we're already feeling like a lack of energy. And so if we go and we connect with other people, it might feel like an effort, but there's that benefit of actually being around people, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of staving off that slow drag towards isolation. Yeah. So there's no easy answer to this. All to say, it's helpful to stay engaged with, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I think would be helpful, testing it out and seeing what the outcome is. Because if I'm just globally feeling a lack of energy during the winter months, then if I base my activity on that lack of energy, then I'm more likely to be more isolated and do less, which ultimately doesn't help me, right? There might be that, fake it till you make it situation where, I don't feel like engaging, or I don't feel like exercising, but I'm going to try it and see if that helps my energy or my emotions, catch up eventually. Mm-hmm. So it's important to test it out and to be sort of considering the likely outcomes of those options.
And as you were talking, also another option is if you feel like, oh, there's a snowstorm and you can't get out. The other option is always calling a friend and just having a conversation. So you're still having some type of social connection to somebody, FaceTime, Zoom. So again, at least having some of that interaction. It doesn't always have to be in person.
Yeah. Yep. And you just reminded me of another example of how it's helpful to talk to other people and get their perspectives on things. So I mentioned, we have children. One of our kids is constantly wishing that it's going to snow every day because she wants a day off from school. So like from her perspective, like a snowstorm is great, right? Like, yay, we could play in the snow, which isn't very appealing to me as an adult who gets cold, but also like a snow day is like, that's more work for me, right, to rearrange my schedule. So I'm a bah humbug about snowstorms. But hearing the excitement of like, oh, this is a different perspective on a snowstorm helps me consider like, oh, how could I actually see a snowstorm in a different way than I typically do, right? Not to deny my obligations, but could I, even for part of the day, sort of embrace that spirit of a snow day or a snowstorm is a fun activity, and how could it be a fun activity for me? And then after I test that out, I can still go back to like, I've got obligations and things to do, and maybe it's not fun the whole day, but it presents opportunities to sort of see something differently. And if you actively decide to engage in something, it's a very different experience than just sort of feeling like I'm just going along with it. So what I mean by that is, if suddenly it's snowing out and it's a snow day, but you work from home, like you don't have other activities, so it doesn't actually change your day at all. It's just, oh, it's snowy out. Actively deciding to like take part of that day and do something different to engage in that snow day can be really helpful, as opposed to feeling like, oh, my day hasn't changed, but now I feel like more boxed in because it's a snow day. Now I can't go out, or I'm restricted in some way. So, putting on jammies, drinking some hot cocoa, and like watching a snowy movie or something, I don't know, whatever would be theoretically enjoyable.
And then also just going back to the impromptu dance party, I go back and I think how great technology is, because you could still do that through Zoom, or again, FaceTiming. Friend who's also maybe in California and wants to have that. Again, technology, I think, could be so helpful in continuing those connections. And so that was just something that I thought of.
Yeah. Another thing that I just thought of that I meant to mention earlier is when daylight is less, particularly after we change the clocks, and all of a sudden it feels like it's dark so soon. Like thinking about like increasing light in your livable space can be really helpful. So that whether that's turning on more lights or adding lights just for the season, the dark season. To like, I'm going to string up lights just to add more color, more light, to feel like there's something positive that I'm adding to this situation that feels like, oh, outside the windows are dark, but I'm adding light inside, or even outdoor light too. I'm a big fan of outdoor lighting. I'd spend countless dollars and time at home improvement stores buying outdoor lights if I could, but I won't. But yeah, just like that idea of like, I'm going to impose more light on my environment can be a helpful thing. Again, there are costs involved in that, but the more you feel like these are options that I can explore, all the better.
And something else which is interesting, you talk about the lighting. They have the aesthetics lights that you can add to your room. Very, again, as my niece calls it, aesthetics. That again, it's great decoration, but it is another way of adding lights. And so I like that idea. So somebody else also mentioned she loves the idea of watching movies and jammies, and also opening the curtains during the days, allowing more light in.
That's
So
a great idea.
That's a great point.
Yeah, particularly if you live in like an older structure, in the wintertime, you might be more used to like pulling curtains to preserve heat, right? Like, oh, I'm paying to heat this space. I want to keep that heat in, and therefore it's a drafty window on a, pull a curtain to keep my heat in. It's an important decision to make. Like, the benefit of pulling back that curtain to let more light in might be worth, the added expense of, a slightly higher heat bill, right? Yeah, so I'll say, like, it's good to think about sort of what we do routinely as part of like how we get through season, and then question, like, is there a benefit to doing it differently?
Also, another comment, great tips for those struggling with their sleep post daylight savings time change, letting them know that LCL has on-demand webinars, including a great one Shawn did on improving sleep. So a shout out to Shawn. And there is a link that I just posted that this person sent us, as well as, again, more related LCL resources for people looking to increase movement and feel part of a virtual community. We have drop-in yoga and drop-in mindfulness. So those are great, great points. So thank you, Laura.
And just to briefly comment on sleep hygiene and improving your sleep, one way to think about why it's disruptive to us to have those, time changes, is that our brains look for external signals to sort of prepare for the passing of time, and to prepare for the sleep cycle and things like that. And so if we didn't have clocks, when the hours of daylight shrunk in the fall, or fall and winter months when it's the less light, we would be waking up earlier and going to bed earlier in compensation of that change. We don't do that. Like, we have our schedules that we stick to, and so light be damned, we're going to do what we're going to do. And so another way of compensating for that is to think about your environment and what you can do to give yourself signals, self-imposed signals, to prepare your brain for sleep. Right. So sleep hygiene is all about having a routine that gives your brain signals that sleep is coming, that you're preparing for sleep. So integrating some good sleep hygiene into your routine during these months is a great idea, not just because I said it, but just because it's a good idea. And again, that can help compensate for that, lack of a signal from the sky to say, like, oh, darkness is approaching, therefore get ready for sleep. Since we're awake well into the darkness, giving yourself signals that, all right, I'm getting ready to prepare for bed. Here's these activities I'm doing in the same order, right? These are signals to my brain. And I could also like start to dim my lights, turn off a few lights to like give myself that signal. It is getting darker in my room or in my apartment, my house. Therefore, like, another signal to my brain. And I always encourage people to think about your 5 senses in terms of those signals. Like, what can you integrate into that routine that's going to activate all of your senses? What you're seeing with light, what you're smelling, what you're feeling, what you're tasting, all of those things can aid in those signals to your brain that sleep is coming or preparing for sleep.
So related to that, I'm just wondering, you probably have your own personal opinion as well as being a psychologist. People who watch TV at night, people who are looking at their phones at night,
Yep.
Which I do.
Mm-hmm.
So any comments on that in terms of, does it make a difference? Is it something we should be paying attention to and really trying to adjust a little bit for better sleep?
Yeah, I would say so. So there's, some strong opinions about, what the blue light from your screens does in terms of like stimulating your eyes and your brain. Instead of focusing on like a particular activity, I encourage people to think about like, what is the effect of that activity on you, right? Because some people, when I've talked about, sleep hygiene and trying not to do things, as you get into your bed, reserving that bed for sex and sleep, so that there's a limited things that you're doing in that bed to be a good trigger for your brain. Some people are like, well, my routine is to read in bed. Should I stop reading? Right. And this is true of, screens as well. Like, I ask, like, what does that activity do for you? Like, does it stimulate your brain, right? Are you now interested in what you're reading, and now you're like, you want to keep reading, and hence it is, antithetical to sleep. Versus, no, when I read, I actually start to drowse off or doze off. I get drowsy and I get tired. So like, all right, well then, if you're reading something that makes you tired, then it sounds like it's helping you as a part of your routine. If you're reading something that engages you, like, oh, I want to read more, next chapter, well, then I wouldn't do that. So screens, it's not just screens, but what's on the screen, right? Is it social media that's like, tapping at your emotions, like, oh, I'm getting frustrated, or like, I'm really interested in, like, did I get likes on this post, right? Like, if it's something that's engaging like that, it's going to wake you up versus calm you down. So really be thinking about the content as well as the actual form of media as well.
That's a very great point. We do have a question. Does less time listening or viewing the news improve your well-being?
I guess it depends on what news you're watching. So yeah, like most things, I think that there is a healthy balance, and what that balance is for you, you're going to have to test that out. I know for myself, I consume a significant amount of news throughout my day. And so I know that if my outlook on life is like starting to be negatively affected by the amount of news that I'm encountering, that's a signal to me to, like, all right, I need to stop watching headline or reading headlines or watching, clips of news. So it's really about that awareness. Like, how am I feeling engaging in this much news? Right? There are times when, the news cycle is packed full of emotionally charged information, world events. And I'm like, it's good to stay informed, but like, I need to draw a line for my mental well-being, my emotional well-being. And so sort of being in tune with that is important. And there are times when, like, I take a break from even, reading any news at all. And I have that juxtaposition of like, oh, I'm feeling like I'm missing out on what's going on, but I'm also feeling better. So, right, there's an active choice to be made there. And sometimes that balance goes back and forth, but it's important to pay attention to that for sure.
That's great. Very helpful. Another comment, love that, using the 5 senses to build habits that encourage routines, whether routines for preparing for sleep or whether routines to encourage people to reach out to social connections or exercise when they're starting to get into patterns, perhaps patterns of withdrawal or stagnation. And balance is important.
Yeah, so routines can be really helpful in terms of like getting yourself to do something on a regular basis. And even routines, even though they're helpful, they can routines can become stagnant, right? And be like, oh, it just feels like like it's the same thing over and over and over again. So one thing to consider if that's your experience is, how can you maintain a helpful routine while injecting novelty into it, right? So an example I've used is, like, I'm very routine oriented when it comes to exercise, because like, if I have to decide day by day, am I going to exercise or not? It's like, too many decisions. I might choose not to. But if I just schedule it, like, nope, going to, this is my schedule, I'm going to repeat this schedule. But the actual activities that I engage in, I need to mix that up, because I don't want to feel bored doing the exercise. So I try to like mix it up to inject that novelty. I'm like, oh, this is different. I'm going to try this type of exercise. And then, but the routine itself, I try to honor while injecting some novelty. So that's something to consider as well. Even in your, sleep hygiene routine, if it just feels stagnant, it's like, oh, how can I maintain the routine, but also inject something new into it?
Excellent. Excellent. I don't see any additional questions, but this has been so very helpful and interesting. Again, something I always learn is that life is not black and white, and there is a balance. And again, you need to pay attention to what's best for you.
For sure.
So that is it. Just so folks know that you will receive a recording of this. So if you want to re-listen, and we will have it posted on our website as well if you have any friends, colleagues that you think would benefit from watching this. So thank you, Dr. Healy. Always great information, and thank you all for joining us. Again, we know that you're busy lawyer. So thank you again, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for attending, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks.